Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming to CarbonTax Return, Lessons from BC's First 5 Years. Thank you so much. My name is Kara Pike, and I'm the founder of Climate Access, which is a global network of more than 2,000 leaders from nonprofit, academia, and government really working to leverage the public's role in advancing climate solutions. And we're really excited to join with the Climate Desk and Bloomberg BNA to bring this briefing to you tonight. Climate Access, our network, is really aiming at trying to equip leaders looking to leverage that public support with the skills they need, sharing resources, problem solving, to really ensure effective communication and public outreach strategies are being developed. And we're really excited to focus on solutions tonight in this dialogue, and we feel it's extremely critical for a number of reasons. First of all, most people care now across Canada and the US about climate change. That's not the issue. We're not arguing about does this problem exist and should we be dealing with it. It does exist, we are dealing, people are accepting that, but there's a lot of fatalism around whether or not we really have it in us to make the kinds of transitions that are needed. And that's really unfortunate because all over North America and other parts of the globe, solutions are emerging and innovation is happening around clean energy and low carbon solutions. So our goal for tonight is to really try and highlight some of those solutions, like what's been happening in British Columbia with the carbon tax, so we can really learn from one another and advance the solutions dialogue forward. So first of all, before we get started, I would just like to thank our sponsors. We really appreciate the support of Bloomberg BNA for helping to bring this event to you. Also for our wine sponsor, Value on Liquor. We're extremely happy that this event is 100% clean energy powered by Bullfrog, so we're grateful for their support. We're also thankful for Ken Greendig from CarbonTax for his help tonight. Deepak Sarasbude from Video Livestream for his live streaming services, and Amy Huba, my colleague at Climate Access, for all the work that she's done today. So before I introduce Chris Mooney and turn it over to him to introduce all of our panelists, I'd like to just ask Marjorie Moore to come up for a few minutes to talk about Bloomberg BNA. Thanks, Marjorie.
Bless you. Thank you, Kara. It's wonderful to be here. I'm Marjorie Moore, Director of Environmental Health and Safety Strategic Alliances. I'm joined here with our team, Terrence Highland and Rebecca Freibush, and our President, Darren McEwen. So please come and chat with us. We've got some materials at the back. And really, this is an exciting panel. The Carbon Tax Return, Lessons Learned from BC's First 5 Years. Really excited to be here. We have been covering environmental news for 37 years. At the back of the room, you'll see one of our flagship publications of International Environment Reporter. The Associated Press calls us the company that's had the longest running news desk, environmental news desk. That's pretty impressive. We also have our Energy and Environment Report and Climate Report that you can grab at the back. But if you don't know us, we're legal publishers. We're kind of behind the paywall, but we're really vocal and getting involved and have about 150 reporters on the Hill and elsewhere reporting on this. We're joined with Jeremy Hainsworth today, who will provide the BC perspective. And we really hope you enjoy this evening. Thank you for coming, and I'll hand it over to Chris.
Okay, where did the cursor go? Hello, everybody. Hi. I love this picture. So welcome to a special installment of Climate Desk Live in Vancouver. I'm Chris Mooney, and I'm a correspondent for the Climate Desk, and I am your host. Let's get straight to business. We want you folks tweeting about what happens at this event. If you're not, your head over your mobile device, writing furiously, then we're going to think that you're not paying attention, okay? So this is the hashtag CDLive, and these are the handles of me and Climate Desk and the panelists who I will introduce in just one moment, and you're going to see these again, so you have no excuse to not be tweeting. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit more about Climate Desk. These are our partners, and the Climate Desk Live is basically a reality-based briefing series sponsored by Climate Desk, and Climate Desk, in turn, is a media consortium of publications covering climate change. These are all of our members, and so what this means is if I write something that appears at Mother Jones, that's about climate change, hey, Slate can use it, The Guardian can use it, Grist can use it. I don't know if you saw the article about the carbon tax that I did about this event, and it started at Mother Jones, but then it was also actually published by Grist, and it was published by The Atlantic. So we pool content, we share resources, we produce more climate coverage than you would have otherwise. So that is what we do. Okay, so I want to introduce our panel and bring them up in the order in which they're going to speak. And each one of them is going to speak for about 8 minutes, and then we're going to have some discussion. And so I'll start with Spencer Chandra Herbert, MLA. Spencer Herbert was reelected for Vancouver West End in 2013. He is the official opposition environment critic and previously served as critic for tourism, arts and culture, and the BC Lottery Corporation and gaming policy. Spencer, thanks for having me. Thanks for being here. Marin Smith. And you might want to get the mic. Yes, get the mic. Okay, Marin is Director of Clean Energy Canada, and that is based at Tides Canada, and she leads a team there working to diversify Canada's energy systems, cut carbon pollution, and reduce the nation's fossil fuel dependence. And she writes and speaks extensively on the opportunities for Canada in the global low-carbon economy. Ross Beattie is chairman of Alterra Power, and they should be appearing, sorry. Here are their hashtags, and Ross isn't on Twitter, but his company is. Okay, so I use that one, so I hope that's okay. He is a geologist and resource company entrepreneur with more than 40 years of experience in the international minerals and renewable energy industries. And in early 2008, he founded Magma Energy Corp to focus on international geothermal development. And in 2011, Magma and Plutonic Power merged to create Alterra Power. So he also founded and currently serves as chairman of Pan American Silver Corp, one of the leading silver producers. And finally, we have Jeremy Hainsworth from Bloomberg BNA. And he's a contributor to the Associated Press as well as Bloomberg BNA, and he's worked with Bloomberg BNA for over 3 years on legal, regulatory, and policy issues in Western Canada for Bloomberg BNA's wide stable of international publications. So this is our panel. Before they start, what I'm going to do is give us a little background so that they don't have to actually engage in exposition. So I will tell you about the carbon tax, and then they will tell you insightful things about the carbon tax. That's the difference. And let me just preface this by saying that as an American, the more I learn about this, the more I'm just sort of blown away. You know, people in British Columbia seem to be this advanced species of being that can actually achieve something on climate change. And so the more I learn about the carbon tax, this is only a personal statement, my reaction is this. Like, I want this, you know, like, where is America compared to what you guys are doing? So the basics, this tax, which went into effect in 2008, and many of you I know this, but I just want to get it out so that we don't have to go back to any of these details, currently set at 30 Canadian dollars per metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions from fuels like gasoline, diesel, and so on. So currently that is 6.67 cents per liter of gas, or 25 cents per gallon of gas. And the tax was phased in, so it got progressively higher over its first 4 years. It started at just $10 per metric ton of carbon. But at this point, any further increases have been frozen now that it's reached $30 per ton. Now, the really interesting and important thing about this is what happens with the money, right? And there's been some $5 billion in revenue so far, and because the tax is revenue neutral, all of that has gone back to you or people in British Columbia. So more than $3 billion has been returned in the form of business tax cuts, along with $1 billion in personal tax breaks and over $1 billion, nearly $1 billion in low-income tax credits to protect those for whom rising fuel costs might actually create the most hardship. And according to the BC Ministry of Finance, for individuals who earn up to $122,000, income tax rates are now Canada's lowest. So this tax could be like a totally bad thing for you if you drive one of these, but you know, if you don't, this might save you money. Okay, so that's what is, you know, reading this from the States, I was like, whoa. Okay, you can do that? Yes, you can actually do that. So with that, let's hear what the panel thinks about how this has worked out over the first 5 years. And so I'll turn it over to Spencer.
All right. Hello. Check, check. Hello. Can you hear me in the back? So I'm a member of the legislature, which for our American guests who are watching at home is kind of like, I guess, a state congress or something like that. So I would be a congressional representative or a maybe a state senator. Anyways, in Canada, the Senate, it's not quite so popular, but maybe in the States, it's not popular either. I don't know. But the carbon tax, I represent a party, it's called the New Democrat Party. And at first, when the carbon tax was, well, let me just jump back for a moment. I've been a lifelong environmentalist because for me, I see climate change as the biggest threat to our future and to my future and my children's futures. So for me, putting a price on pollution is important. You've got to drive it down somehow. That's one method to do it. The carbon tax is one of those ways you can. So before I ran for politics, I'd almost sent a letter to our Minister of Finance saying, you should put in a carbon tax. For some reason, I wasn't happy with the draft. It never got sent. And then I decided to run to become a member of the legislature. I ran, became a member. During that period, my party had decided, the New Democratic Party had decided they preferred cap and trade legislation as opposed to a carbon tax. So they were actually quite against the carbon tax and launched a campaign saying, axe the tax. Don't do it. Stop the tax. And so that was challenging for me because I live in a constituency where 70% of my constituents walk, bike, or bus to get to work. We live downtown. It's easy to do that. So I set about trying to change the channel within my own party to, in fact, embrace the carbon tax because we didn't win that election. Cap and trade wasn't going to happen. So let's get with the program, and the carbon tax was a way to do it. It's proven very successful in British Columbia, but I say it's proven successful not just because it's a price on carbon, but also because there were a whole suite of other policies that came along with it. So things like expansion of transit. We pulled a bunch of cars off the road because we were able to get transit from the airport and from Richmond into downtown Vancouver. We launched a program called the Live Smart program, and that program was to allow you to retrofit your homes so that you weren't burning gas in your homes because it was leaking out the windows because it was so poorly insulated. There were a range of those kinds of programs that went along with it. So the carbon tax, as it's creeped up, certainly people have made other choices. Now I should be clear though, the economy hasn't suffered in terms of the relation of rest of Canada. In fact, we've in some cases done better than the rest of Canada. So it's not a job killer. Our federal government says it's a job killer. They're wrong. It's worked in British Columbia. We have managed to reduce our climate change emissions, which is a hugely important thing to do. But since then, after the 5 years, we're 5 years in, how are we doing now? I would argue that our provincial government has since abandoned the field. They've said the carbon tax doesn't hurt the economy, it's good to fight climate change, but now we don't have to do anything because we're ahead of everybody else. And that's a challenge for me because I think there are areas that we could take this further. I think they're venting in the oil and gas industry. It's about 5% of BC's emissions. We don't tax that. We don't say you're putting pollution into the atmosphere through the venting of carbon, and you should pay, yet the mom and pop who have to drive their kid to soccer practice, they pay when they fill up gas. So it is a challenge. There are certainly a lot more policy innovations that we're going to have to take to continue to drive down emissions, because right now the trajectory seems to be that we're going to start swinging upwards again unless we take further action. But you know, we've got to put a price on pollution. There's no way around it. You can call it cap and trade, you can call it a carbon tax. Yes, we're the first carbon tax jurisdiction. Of course, California has a cap and trade system. Alberta has a kind of a carbon levy. There are ways to do this. You don't have to adopt our system, but I think it works. I would argue, though, that we also need to provide a bit of a carrot as well, not just a stick of the price. When you put a price on something, yes, people don't want to pay it, so they change their behavior. And we started to see that happen. But in some parts of British Columbia, you don't really have as much of a choice as you might where I live. So I think what I would argue, if we're going to potentially increase the carbon tax in the future, we should look at taking some of that money and putting it into transit, putting it into home energy retrofit programs, business retrofit programs, that kind of thing, so that you're also giving people an option. So they're not just paying the increased cost where they may not have a choice, but they also have a choice. And that makes it a little bit more palatable. Of course, getting an income tax cut helps as well, which is how we did it in British Columbia. So, you know, it's a good policy, but by all means, it's not the end-all, be-all policy. We need to see Oregon, we need to see Washington, we need to see other places start to adopt policy like this. because some make the argument competitively it can be challenging for the economy. It hasn't proven that way so far for most industries in British Columbia, but it could if we were going to massively increase it without thinking through those other competitive pressures. We'd be helped if Washington and other places started to adopt policies similar to ours, so we don't have the bleed into Washington as we have people driving down there to buy gas, so they don't have to pay the carbon tax as we've seen here. But the carbon tax is one small percentage of the tax on gas here. We've already had gas prices, taxes on our gas for quite some time, including for transit use. So it's small comparatively to a number of the other taxes we have, with some economists arguing that we need to get to $100 a ton rather than $30 a ton in order to make a difference. So I'm a fan. I think we need to tax pollution, but I would argue that it's not the be-all, end-all in terms of fighting climate change. So thank you.
Great. Can you hear me out there? Check, check, check. Okay, how's that? Great. Well, thanks. Thanks to you all for organizing this and you all for coming. You know, I find it's like Thursday night and people are going to come to a reception for drinks to talk about climate and carbon policy. Like, usually that's a pretty bleak subject. But actually, I was really excited to come here because it's like, you know, we have this amazing success story to tell, and people, even here in BC, don't really understand the success of BC's carbon tax, let alone all you people out in video land who are, aren't here in BC mostly, to hear the story. So I'm excited to tell you why I think it's very successful and how we could make it even more successful. So first, why is it successful? Well, frankly, it is working. And I know it's you've all had a few drinks and you don't want a lot of numbers, but I'm going to give you just a couple. So here in BC, we shifted the tax from taxing income, which we all want, income, to taxing pollution that we don't want. So the hypothesis is that would reduce the pollution and the economy would stay strong. Well, it worked. Fossil fuel consumption in BC is down, and greenhouse gas emissions are down. The GDP in British Columbia is up, and the population is up. So those are the four basic stats. And I'm seeing Alex Wood here. I have to thank Sustainable Prosperity, who did an analysis. The carbon tax came in 2008, and this looks at 2008 to 2012. So let's look at some of the numbers. Fossil fuel consumption. So between 2008 and 2012, per capita fossil fuel consumption of the fossil fuels taxed by the carbon tax has gone down 15%. 15% in BC. Well, I know some people are out there thinking, well, there was a recession between 2008 and 2012 and fossil fuel consumption went down everywhere. Well, let's compare it to the rest of Canada. The rest of Canada, up 1.3%, down 15%, up, well, 1% is only a little bit, but still, the differential, 16.4%, that's significant. Okay, let's look at greenhouse gas emissions. So we don't have quite the same range of data there, only 2008 to 2010, down 10% in British Columbia. Let's compare to the rest of Canada, only down 5%, down twice as much in BC. So it's looking pretty good. It's looking like our hypothesis worked, that we're going to tax pollution and we're going to reduce pollution. That part's working. And what about the economy? That's what everybody says. You're going to put on a carbon tax, it's going to destroy the economy. Well, BC's economy, as somebody said, is outpacing every other economy in British Columbia, in Canada. Our provincial economy was, in 2012, outpacing the rest of them. So I really think we can't say that the carbon tax has had an adverse impact on the economy. And as was mentioned, we have the lowest income tax, personal income tax rate in Canada, and BC, Alberta, and New Brunswick are tied for the lowest corporate tax rate in Canada. So it also isn't causing us to be an overly taxed population. Okay, so that's my first message, is it's working in terms of reducing pollution and in terms of the economy. So my second message is, it's popular. Everybody loves the carbon tax.
I don't know.
Just kidding. Of course, people hate taxes. So if you ask them a question, do you like the carbon tax? You know, you're not going to really get a great answer. But if you ask them, out of the different types of taxes, which are your favorite taxes? The carbon tax. The carbon tax comes out number 2. People like to tax corporations first and pollution second. That's not bad out of the range of taxes. So in 2011, 3 years after the tax was introduced, roughly just over 70% of British Columbians either somewhat supported or greatly supported the carbon tax, which is pretty impressive. That number's coming down. I'm not going to pretend that people are loving the carbon tax, but I think that's actually a failure of the government. We did focus groups in the fall in BC, and when you talk to people about the carbon tax, they forgot they got an income tax reduction. They totally forgot. They don't believe it's revenue neutral because they've never seen anything that explains that to them. In fact, most people don't even understand what revenue neutral means in terms of taxes, but definitely they do not trust the government that is revenue neutral. So there's a bit of failure of communication there. Another myth about it, but people do, it's a popular tax. Of the taxes people love to hate, it's one of the popular ones. Another myth we hear is that the rural population is greatly opposed to it. Well, in fact, there was a review of the carbon tax in 2012. There was 2,200 letters. They did it in the summer, which, you know, we don't have a lot of warm weather in British Columbia, so you put a 4-week carbon tax review in the middle of the summer, you're not going to get a lot of response. They got 2,200 letters, 1,700 in support of the carbon tax. 33% of those letters were from rural communities, which really is what our population breakdown is. 33% rural, 40-odd% Vancouver, 25-odd% Victoria, you know, and environs. So it's actually not true that rural people are opposed. There are definitely some very vocal opponents in the rural communities, no denying that. Even business, even the oil and gas community, in talking with some of them, you know, I had one corporate leader say to me, you know, it took us 3 weeks. Our company was for the cap and trade. We were not supportive publicly of the carbon tax. It took us 3 weeks with an accountant to get the carbon tax implemented. If we'd had cap and trade, we would have been paying lawyers for years, huge sums of money to get the system implemented. It's a very simple, very effective method. So British Columbians are basically pretty proud of it. So it's working, it's popular, and lastly, it is good, but it could be even better. And so to build on what some of the things that Spencer said, it only covers combustion of fossil fuels. It doesn't cover fugitive emissions, etc. We calculated that if we tax the fugitive emissions, it would bring in $158 million. Why don't we do it? They're not being taxed because in 2008 we didn't have the technology to do it. We now have the technology to measure what those emissions are. We could therefore tax them. Let's do that. Let's take these new revenues, secondly, and put them towards solutions. That is what the public wants. And in these focus groups, it was amazing how the public wants the taxing the pollution to go to solving the problem. Put it towards transit. Put it towards energy efficiency. And thirdly, let's keep raising it by $5 a year. It's 1.1 cents on a liter of gas. People are not going to notice that. We could raise it $5 a year for another 4 years. It would be up to $50 a ton. That's going to have even more impact on reducing pollution, carbon pollution, and take that new revenue, put it towards solutions. We might even solve our transit problem in Vancouver. So to wrap up, it's a real success story. The hypothesis was we were going to tax pollution and reduce pollution, and we did it. It's not impacting the economy, and it's something that British Columbians are very proud of. It's attracted low-carbon business to BC and has created a green sheen around British Columbia, which helps us in other ways as well. And so I really encourage other jurisdictions to get on board. We do need other jurisdictions. We need Washington, we need Oregon, and others to get on board with the carbon tax. And it's a successful story. So let's get it out there. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, my turn, I think. I'm the token businessman on the panel. I'm a geologist from Vancouver. I am an entrepreneur. I've started many public companies, and I spent most of my career in the minerals and mining industries. But I'm also an environmentalist. I'm a hardcore environmentalist. It may seem like a contradiction. It is. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't do what you think is good for you and your family and your country and your world. So in 2008, I decided to try to build a clean energy company, thinking I could apply my business skills, my capital raising skills, public company experience, and try to build a clean energy company to first start on geothermal power. I thought I could build a geothermal business, much like a mining company has resources in the ground, and you drill holes and you discover resources, and then you build plants and you produce electricity instead of sell gold or silver. And I did that for a few years, and then in 2011 I took over a Vancouver company called Plutonic Power. And so today our company is called Altera Power, and we produce about 600 megawatts of clean energy. And I mean clean energy. This is wind, solar, hydro, and geothermal. These are the true clean energy technologies. We don't do biofuels. I think it's, you're emitting carbon in burning wood and other types of biofuels. So we do the four classic clean energy technologies, and we've built a company now that's we're in our 6th year now. We produce about enough power to generate electricity for all of Vancouver. It's a mid-sized company. We have operations in Iceland, Nevada, British Columbia. We operate the largest wind farm in BC near Chetwynd, and we operate the largest run-of-river hydro facility north of Powell River. So that's been my experience, and I will say I don't have personal experience with the carbon tax particularly, but really pricing carbon is one of to me, the three tools or the three planks of addressing global warming and addressing carbon emissions that are polluting the atmosphere and having all manner of negative consequences for every species on Earth. Clean energy is one, trying to get us off of generating electricity from carbon emissions, through carbon emissions. That's clearly a good answer, a long-term answer, truly a permanent answer, in fact. The other is electricity conservation, making do with less, so you don't have to generate electricity or burn fuel to get around. You actually use things more efficiently, and that to me is another very long-term solution. It's actually the best. And the third is to price carbon emissions properly, because they do represent a cost to all of society and all of nature. And in that sense, cap and trade's great. A carbon tax is great. A carbon tax, I think, is even better. It's simple, it's clear, it's effective. You have a lot of very good jurisdictions that are applying it, and it's working. So all of those do kind of the same. They all go towards the same end, and they're all good things to do. Just in terms of clean energy, which is my own background and experience, there's a few observations. The first is there's no such thing as clean energy. All forms of electricity generation create negative impacts, and that you have to understand. There's no such thing as a good hydro project. It all has negative impacts. A good solar business, a good wind farm, but they're minuscule, I think, compared to the negative impacts of burning coal or oil or even gas or nuclear. So it's a matter of what's the best of the worst. The second is clean energy is not alternative energy anymore. It's an absolute core business in the world. In the last 10 years, there's been $1.5 trillion spent on generation of clean energy all over the world. $1.5 trillion. It's mainstream power now. It's established and it's growing. It's been growing every year for the last 10 or 12 years. There were a couple of years that have seen a little bit of less power generation globally because of the recession, but it's been growing strongly. It's an absolutely established form, and especially in places like Europe and China, United States. These are places where the generation of clean energy has just gone through the roof. Look for incredible developments in the next 5 years in China. China has a serious pollution problem. Everybody knows that. But there's no country in the world that's doing more to try to address that than China is right now. And I think you're going to see some amazing amazing amounts of clean energy and some incredible technology development that's happening in China that's going to be applicable all over the world. Clean energy prices are falling through the floor. Solar panels today cost a quarter what they did 5 years ago. Wind farms, wind turbines are much less expensive. There's a huge amount of manufacturing capacity in the world for wind technology, solar technology, and this is reducing the cost of clean energy today. This wasn't the case 5 or 10 years ago, but today it is the case, where clean energy can actually compete in many, many places in the world, not all, but in many places of the world, can compete without needed incentives. There have been a lot of incentives for clean energy, which is great because it's encouraged governments to promote it, it's encouraged companies to produce it, it's encouraged utilities to produce it. And so the rapid growth of clean energy has meant that now there are a lot of manufacturing plants, there's a lot of good technology. The more you produce, the lower your costs get per unit. And so you can produce it more cheaply. And this is driving more and more and more development, competing against coal plants and gas plants and oil and nuclear. So we're building a wind farm right now in Texas, a 200 megawatt wind farm where we have good wind, good prices, a good stable market, and we can virtually compete now with any other form of power generation, including gas. So this is a triumph. This is an absolute success after 10 years of lobbying by people interested in the environment, trying to stop carbon emissions, trying to slow down global warming. This is a good result that we should all be happy about. And I think there's an awful lot yet to come in this area. Equally, energy conservation. There's massive efforts. I think some of the numbers that Marin was talking about in British Columbia reflect that. We're using less electricity, yet we have a larger economy and more people. That's not just the carbon tax. That's a lot of individuals saying, I want to use less carbon, I want to have a more efficient light bulb, a better refrigerator, and maybe a car that goes 35 or 40 miles to the gallon instead of 15 or 20 or 25. So I'm very optimistic that these trends will continue. It's a tough business, a very, very tough business, the clean energy business. It's truly high risk, low return, which is not a good recipe for business success generally. But it's the right thing to do, and I think ultimately, not just my company, but many, many companies will soon be seen as mainstream energy producers instead of alternate or fringe or unusual producers of electricity. And this is all because the public is demanding it. Some governments are getting it. As I said, I think you're going to see heroic things happening in China in the next 5 years. You've seen incredible growth in this business in Europe. Some countries in Europe are, they're almost entirely renewable now, which is incredible. British Columbia has the fortune of having all of this hydropower development, and we're very lucky that way. But we're sitting at the edge of a precipice with this wall or this juggernaut of LNG development coming at us, and with the potential of it being powered, massive amounts of electricity coming from gas drive and creating all kinds of carbon emissions, as opposed to what British Columbia is famous for, which is clean energy. So I'm very much a supporter of the carbon tax. I think it's having great results. I'm supportive of alternative energy. I'm supportive of energy conservation. They're all having an impact, and I think it's nice to talk about some of the successes here in the carbon tax tonight. Thank you.
Okay, is this working? Can you hear me at the back? I'll start by saying that of all the coverage I've done in this area over the last few years, that I agree with everything that I've heard from the people to my right. Marin, spot on. This is seen as something of a success story. However, there are things that counter it. Up? We can't hear you back here. How's that? Better, okay. When I was asked to do this and I started looking at it, and I'm going to have to explain this for the people joining us from the US, I was reminded of a television program called Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister. The minister was a mediocre politician by the name of Jim Hacker, and he has a senior bureaucrat by the name of Sir Humphrey Appleby, who makes his life very, very difficult. Now, every once in a while, somebody would talk to Hacker and present him with what seemed to him as being a good idea. And being the politician that he was, he would formulate a policy which Humphrey would, of course, be given to implement. Humphrey would get his way in the end by in maintaining the status quo by describing the idea as courageous. Hacker would say, I plan to do X. Humphrey would say, how very courageous, Minister. And Hacker would say, oh dear, why is that? And he would back down. A brave decision was one that would get you votes, whereas a courageous one would be one that would lose you the election. Now, I don't know if BC's carbon tax is brave or courageous or a good initiative. On its face, it's a fantastic thing. And as I say, I agree with everything that I've heard to the right. What we have, as you've mentioned, is the liquefied natural gas proposals, which are in various stages of the assessment process or approval processes before the National Energy Board and the Environmental Assessment Board of or Office of British Columbia. For quite a few of these proposals have been granted export permit licenses by the National Energy Board, and they're in various phases of the process, as I say. This is where this entire issue around the carbon tax gets muddy. September 2013 report from Clean Energy Canada said BC has promised the world's cleanest LNG industry. What it found, however, was that in a study of 2 BC proposed plants and technologies is that the emissions would be triple those of plants in Australia and Norway. And I also had to chuckle when we were talking, but someone mentioned a flaring of natural gas. I was reminded of that this morning when I was texting Spencer and talking about northeastern BC, which at sunset looks like the scene from Road Warrior. Anyway, this study looked at data from wellhead to shipment. So this is from the gas fields, primarily in the provinces northeast, to the west coast of British Columbia, from Squamish, which is not far from Vancouver, up to Prince Rupert and Kitimat. What the study found was that Norwegian plants produced between 0.35 and 0.36 metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions for each metric ton of LNG produced. The report found that the BC facilities, as proposed, would produce 0.96 metric tons emissions per ton of gas produced. Okay, I'm just looking at my notes here, and you'll have to excuse me from reading. I'm a writer. I'm not a speaker. I use a pen and a computer. Anyway, March 11th, BC's Environmental Assessment Office ordered a comment period for the assessment of BG Group's Prince Rupert LNG. Canada's National Energy Board, December 17th, approved a 25-year export permit application for Prince Rupert LNG for an annual volume of 21 million metric tons of LNG. So remember, we're dealing with this 0.96 metric tons of emissions per ton of gas produced. So here's the other plant's numbers. Wood fiber LNG, 60 million metric tons. WCC LNG, 30 million metric tons. According to the Sustainable Prosperity think tank, British Columbia's introduction of the carbon tax was followed by a fuel consumption drop of 17.4% per capita. And that, as we've heard, allowed the province to have Canada's lowest income taxes. Now, this is something that Jim Hacker would probably not think brave or courageous at all. Sustainable Prosperity, I probably got that backwards. Sustainable Prosperity said the carbon tax shift has been a highly effective policy to date. And quote, they said, it has contributed to a significant reduction in fossil fuel use per capita with no evidence of overall adverse economic impacts and has enabled BC to have Canada's lowest income taxes. I spend a lot of time going to BC Chamber of Commerce meetings and Vancouver Board of Trade meetings, and this is something that's touted and heard quite a lot. And we've already heard that. The report noted while the findings show a correlation between fuel use and the carbon tax, they cannot show conclusively that the tax caused the shift. What it did say was that data were consistent with similar results from several European countries, so we don't have a consistent correlation. Mark Jacquard, an environmental economist, has said it'll take many years to get a firmer sense of the tax's full effect. So we're not quite on firm ground yet, according to this particular economist. He also said that compulsory policies such as cap and trade or regulations on technologies or fuels can reduce emissions just as effectively as a carbon tax, although perhaps not. Anyway, we'll move on from that. I don't edit very well at 6:30 in the morning. As I say, all of this is going forward as we move to liquefied natural gas. There's as many as 10 plants proposed for the province's coast. Gas would come from the province's northeast. Some of it is potentially bound for the west coast of Oregon. Some other numbers on those proposed plants, 19.6 million metric tons, 1.8 million metric tons, 10 million metric tons, 24 million metric tons. And remembering again, this is 0.96 metric tons of emissions per metric ton produced. That's 166.4 million metric tons annually. So balancing that against the emissions reductions from the carbon tax, it kind of starts to pale. And this is the same government that's doing both of these things. We've got Premier Christy Clark, who's trumpeting what a great triumph the carbon tax is. She's also the person who is single-handedly pushing for the liquefied natural gas industry. Now, granted, the liquefied natural gas industry is going to bring a hell of a lot of investment to this province. We're talking billions and billions of dollars. It's going to bring thousands of jobs in the construction phase and the operational phase. This is great. Jim Hacker would love this. This is a great idea. And I'm getting close to the end here. One of the things that has been suggested for running the liquefied natural gas industry is using using natural gas. To that end, several years ago, the province used the the Clean Energy Act, Spencer, and declared the use of natural gas, if it was used to power liquefied natural gas plants, to be a green fuel. I'm not going to offer any editorial opinion on that, and I think I just did. What the province intends to raise through the liquefied natural gas process is 130 billion to 260 billion over 30 years through direct taxes. So there's a hell of a lot of money coming from this. But again, we've got all of these emissions. So the other thing we have to remember out of all this is that all of this gas is coming from the gas fields in northeastern British Columbia. It's known as the Peace Region. If you drive 400 miles directly east of the Peace Region, you will arrive at a community called Fort McMurray. Fort McMurray is the center of the oil sands. As I say, I agree with everything that I've heard to the right, but I think what's being touted as an incredibly good tax in this province, and it may well be on its face by itself, all of that has to be balanced against what's being attempted to be brought into this province. So take it for what it is. Thanks.
So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to take the moderator's privilege of asking them a couple of questions, and then I'm going to let you have the privilege of asking them a couple of questions. And I get the feeling that a lot of it's going to be about liquefied natural gas, so I'm going to save those questions a little bit and do some things that are maybe simpler first. Okay, so let me back up. When I write an article, I try not to read the comments. Okay, because it's just very, it's depressing, right? But if one were to read the comments on the articles I've written about carbon tax, you find something coming up again and again, which is just that people drive across the border and fill up their cars, and that this, in some way, undermines the whole system. All right? This is like people tweeting, "Aha, I refuted you." I don't think it's actually that simple, but I wondered if, and this is for everybody to comment on, is that actually happening, and is it making a significant dent in the effectiveness of this or not?
Okay, I'll jump in first because I brought it up first.
Okay.
I think traveling to the States, it's all got to do with how much the Canadian dollar's worth, how much the American dollar's worth. Certainly some people will do it if they live close to the border, but they also pair that up with a trip to the Walmart or the Costco and get cheaper products and those kinds of things to bring across the border, or to take a cheap flight out of Bellingham or something like that. But I wouldn't say that it undermines completely the purpose of a carbon tax. I think some people have done that, but I wouldn't say that that's anywhere near the majority. Okay. So no, I don't think that that would be a reason not to do a carbon tax.
Any other comments? This is open to everybody.
Yeah, I would just agree with what Spencer said, and so to add to it, I mean, I would say there's a valid point. BC did this, they took this leadership position. There was a sense that others would follow, and you know, we need Washington to follow. We need Oregon to follow. We need California to get their price on carbon up. There's no question about it. I don't think it's undermining the carbon tax. That some people do that. They go across the border and they buy their groceries. They go across and, you know, it's not undermining our economy up here.
Okay.
So my observation to that question, it's really just the same exact issue of, well, why bother having any price for carbon or any cap and trade, or, you know, why bother supporting Kyoto, or why bother supporting any climate initiative whatsoever? Because we all know that, you know, they're not doing it in Africa, they're not doing it in South America, they're not doing it in China, they're not doing it in lots of places. So let's not do it because it's going to undermine our competitiveness. And it's just a bunch of BS. It's just not. It's just shallow, short-term thinking that politicians should actually be the very ones who overcome that, who are elected to lead and to create a country that's going to exist for the long term and for the welfare of its people for the long term. This is such shallow thinking. It's the same thinking of the person who gets in their car and goes to the States to buy cheaper gas because it's cheaper. The fact is, and why putting a price on carbon through a carbon tax or a cap and trade, it's all about paying the real cost of burning a liter of fuel in your car, or heating your home with gas or with oil, or using cement that is created by a huge amount of fossil fuel generation. It's paying a real price for the real cost to the world, and that's, to me, the triumph of why a carbon tax is a good thing, and forward-thinking people. And I have to credit Gordon Campbell for doing this. He was the guy who brought in the carbon tax. Gordon Campbell had a kind of an epiphany when he went to China. And he came back and instituted the carbon tax, which took a lot of, it was a very unpopular thing to do because who wants taxes, as we've all said. It was very unpopular, but he had a vision. He wanted a clean world. He wanted a world that was reducing its CO2 emissions, not increasing them. He brought in a Clean Energy Act, a very forward-thinking thing that really he had his name on. And this was, to me, a great thing. If only we had people in Ottawa now that had this forward thinking. In fact, we have the exact opposite. There's many things I like about the Conservatives, many things I like about free markets, but I don't like Stephen Harper's neglect of the environment and science and research. This is not a good thing for any country that aspires to be a world leader in, for that matter, anything. He's just missing the point. And so, we've all got to take a lead here if we're going to try to have a world where we price pollution properly. Narrow-minded, short-term thinkers don't do it. And if a politician is of that ilk, I just hope he gets voted out in the next election. Because it's the forward thinkers that are going to create a world that's better for everybody. And I don't just mean people, I mean every single species on Earth that will benefit from a stable climate and a relatively stable ecosystem that we can live with, fish in the ocean that we like to enjoy, and all the nature around us. It's being hammered right now with increasing CO2 and global warming.
Okay, I think that is a very good rebuttal to all the trolls. Okay, you want to say anything else?
The environmental effects of the tax aside, what I would say is I have lived in the Peace region where all of the LNG gas is coming from. I've lived in various rural parts of British Columbia, and when I talk to people up there, they complain about this being punitive. because they have to drive long distances to get anywhere, and they don't have the access to driving across the border. They're not paying the carbon tax to drive across the border, but the people up in northern British Columbia would love to be able to drive across the border. So there's different attitudes towards it.
Can I just make a comment on
please.
that? So another thing that people forgot from 2008 is people in northern British Columbia get a tax credit. In addition, the people who live close to the border would love that tax credit that northern British Columbians get, because studies have shown that that tax credit is more than what they pay on the carbon tax. So there's actually a lot of there's not a lot of understanding about how the tax works, and the low-income tax credits and the tax credit for northerners. So I agree. I used to live up in Smithers. They all think that they're unfairly.
Is that the Northern Living Allowance?
No, it's a carbon tax credit for northerners. Yeah. But I'm really glad you brought it up, because there is a lot of misinformation about the carbon tax. So they assume they're getting a bad deal and they'd be better off living close to the border. But in fact, they wouldn't be financially.
Okay, I'm going to go on to another question. We have people on the live stream who are in the United States, quite a lot of them. I think some people have actually gotten together to watch this together. So this question is probably what they're thinking right now, I hope, which is, what lessons learned from this whole process, this 5-year process of implementing this tax and figuring out what it did, and seeing how people reacted to it positively and negatively, could be exported? Is there anything generalizable? Is there anything where you can say, aha, we learned this and we might even do it differently because of this, so next time somebody tries this, they should already have this on their little notepad to take it down? Is there anything like that? All of you, yes.
I would just jump in to say that people say everybody hates taxes. I think the reality is people will accept taxes if they understand the benefit that they get from it. Because I think everybody wants good schools, they want good health care, they want a road that they can drive down or walk down or ride their bike down without falling into a giant pit or something like that, if they understand. And that's the thing with the carbon taxes, and that's why it was troubling and really difficult, I think, at first, and still is, as we're hearing on this panel, is that people see the price at the pump, and they wonder, or at least think about it, well, geez, I'm paying out here, is that guy over there paying out there? Maybe he's not. Well, there's an issue of fairness, or, in the case of some of the bigger businesses, why aren't they paying it if I have to pay it? So if you can demonstrate that, whether it's an income tax change, whether or not it's some sort of a public benefit that they can see, I think that's much more likely to get supported. And, I think in 2008, when this really took off in British Columbia, we'd had one of the warmest winters previous, so people could really see climate change was staring us in the face. It was quite different for people. So I think as more and more of these extreme weather events are occurring, and droughts and wildfires and whatever have you, it becomes really clear that we need to act, and that this is one tool to do it that, if done right, isn't punitive. But also the social justice aspect, I think, is one of the challenging things, is because with the carbon tax as it is today, there's a low income tax credit, but as the tax is increased, more lower income folks are falling through the cracks, and so it is more punitive on them. And so you need to address these issues of social justice, because not everybody has the same choice that somebody with money has to make changes, to buy a hybrid or what have you. And so if you can address how it impacts different sectors, you're much more likely to get support than just trying to ram it through or say, well, we're going to hit you with a tax because it's good to be green. Well, not everybody wants to do that or can do that. They want to make sure that they can eat.
Yeah, we've thought about this a lot, and so here's a couple of ideas. So one is start it low. Like what we did, $10 and then $5 increments per year. And if they had continued it, it would be up to 50 soon, but $10, that's really not much, and you can handle it and get used to the idea. Secondly, I really believe that starting at revenue neutral was crucial, because once it was put in place as revenue neutral, the government couldn't just rip it out. I personally believe that the Christy Clark Liberal government would have turfed it, except for if they did, they would have had to put in place another tax to replace it. And so there was just no point in doing that. You might as well keep the carbon pollution. What they did was froze it, as has been pointed out. But thirdly, so I would start it low, have incremental increases every year, start it with the first chunk being revenue neutral, then the second chunk I would start putting towards those projects, those things that will reduce carbon and make it highly visible. So people can see, I'm paying this pollution tax, wow, I'm seeing this thing over here, these solar panels, this transit system. I'm watching that money get transferred to a transition in our economy. So what was my third one or fourth one, wherever I'm at? There's another one, I'll remember it. Yeah, but I know what it was, is education, and this is what did not happen in BC, is people don't understand it. There was sort of a big flurry about the carbon tax in '08, and it was on your bills, and you got a picture of the gas pump where they actually had it on a bunch of gas pumps. Well, that's dwindled away, and so people don't remember it. And I think there needs to be an ongoing education campaign put into it. If you think of drinking and driving, or you think of smoking, those things took decades for people, but people understand now, right? We don't drink and drive because it kills people, right? We've heard the stats, they come over and over. Or smoking. We keep getting the information about why we're not doing it. Whereas the carbon tax, we really don't have the connection between we're taxing that and here's how it's making society better. So education is key.
All right. So the defining thing between sort of Americans and Canadians in terms of our forms of government is explicit in each country's constitution. The United States is all about, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Our constitution says we're all about peace, order, and good government. It's a lot more boring, but it's a lot more government, and government means higher taxes. So we are kind of just inherently more accepting of taxes, I think, than Americans. I have a lot of American friends, they just hate taxes, absolutely hate them. So my solution for our dear American listeners here is don't call it a tax. And here's my clever idea. I just thought of it. So here's the clever idea. Charge everybody $30. Charge everybody, an amount. Call it a charge or an impost. It means the same thing as a tax, but don't call it a tax. Call it a charge, and give people credits if they don't generate CO2. So the exact opposite of a tax. Charge everybody a fixed amount that equals the actual carbon tax revenue amount for the economy, but then give people deductions. So they have to pay less, not more. They have to pay less if they don't use carbon. What do you think? I'm not going to be prime minister or governor.
I just echo what Maren said about education. It's just keep it out there and keep that positive reinforcement going. That way, people understand that they're actually doing something good by paying this tax. There's the benefits for them coming back, but there's also the benefits to the environment, and let people continue to know that.
But just if I can just jump in quickly, I think the issue is that people don't see carbon as an immediate problem. And sometimes the idea, well, I drove across town, there was no impact. What was the issue? We've got to popularize and I think really make it clear that carbon has a price, not just in terms of climate change, but also in terms of healthcare, also in terms of how we breathe in our lungs, and that there is a real cost and that you end up paying for it somewhere. Either you pay for it because your grandmother has gotten sick with respiratory illness, or you have yourself and you can't leave your home because you have asthma, or you pay for it because your kid is not going to be able to see the salmon that you love because the rivers have got too hot because of climate change. Like, we have to be clear that there is a real cost. In BC, we've probably lost a couple $2 billion worth just in the forestry industry because of climate change, because a little pine beetle has decided to eviscerate the pine forest because it wasn't frozen to death in the winter, because the winters aren't as cold as they used to be. So the cost is now. It's not like we're talking about 20, 50, 100 years from now, which is how we seem to still talk about climate change. It's coming. Well, no, it's here. It's here. It's only going to get worse, but it's here now. And if we see the results now of it, we should also be paying to reduce the cost of it to us, because it's costing us money. It's not some sort of, we should pay into the do-gooder fund through a carbon tax, but we should have to pay it because it's costing us.
Yeah, so I thought of my other one, which was come talk to us if you're thinking of putting it in the States in various jurisdictions, because there were communities who were very up in arms about it. And I would say get out to those communities first and preempt the whole thing. So there was the farmers, you know, who are living at pretty low to the ground. They're not making huge profits. There's the greenhouse growers who are providing food locally but have a hugely carbon intensive product. There's the low income community, and there's ways to deal with that. And as Spencer said, it needs to be built upon. So there was different communities who were opposed to it, and we probably have lessons that we could share with you about how to get ahead of that, because getting ahead of it is key.
Okay, my last question before we throw it open to the floor. So Jeremy made a lot of remarks and comments about liquefied natural gas, seeming to suggest that it could basically undermine the whole gains from the carbon tax. And I think I'll just ask the other three panelists to comment on what he said, and is that something you agree with, and is it that bad, or is it going to be that bad?
Let's start on the left.
It's a big subject, LNG. I would have a very simple answer if you asked me what do I think about the Northern Gateway pipeline. That's pretty black and white. LNG to me is a transition fuel. It's a fuel that will help bridge the difference between today's focus in Asia on coal-fired generation and hopefully ultimately no CO2 fired generation at all at some point in the future. Natural gas is a lot cleaner than oil or coal, and it's probably net better than, say, nuclear. So it's something I have a hard time going against in principle. And LNG is again, you're basically shipping Canadian gas to Asia, where it will be used to generate electricity and offset power generated from coal. So in that sense, I support it. The devil's in the detail, and some of the detail you've heard from Jeremy. Some of these formations have a lot of CO2 in them, and when you pump out the natural gas, you release a lot of that CO2. Nature doesn't create all gas fields equally, and some are very, very CO2 rich, and some are minimally CO2 rich. And I don't know which is going to come from what reservoir when they start to flow. That's going to be a big issue, and I don't know what to do about that. That's maybe Marin has a lot more experience in that, but I just know they're all the different reservoirs have different CO2 contents. The bigger picture problem, I think, is how these LNG businesses use electricity or use power to liquefy, compress, cool, liquefy the gas, put it on a boat so it can be shipped off to Asia. It's an incredibly energy consumptive business because you have to compress this stuff, 300 times and cool it to a very, very 160 degrees centigrade, I think, minus 160 Fahrenheit. Yeah, very, very cold amounts. So that uses a huge amount of power. There's two ways to power that. You can either power it through electricity or you can power it through gas. Most of the LNG companies want to use gas because they control the supply, it's secure, they understand it, they own it. It's just like what they're doing in Alberta in the tar sands. They're using fossil fuels to generate fossil fuels because it's their business. It's ingrained in their chemistry. They don't want to use electricity here because they're worried it's going to cost more. It's out of their control. They have to deal with a government monopoly, which is influenced by politicians. And vagaries of time in terms of quite frankly, water supply and hydro generation. So it's risky, and so naturally any company that wants to have less insecure forms of power generation wants to use its own power. So unless the government of British Columbia requires these companies to use electricity that is generally generated from clean sources like hydro in British Columbia or wind in British Columbia. We have lots and lots of untapped wind sources. We have lots and lots of untapped hydro sources. Thousands and thousands of megawatts of untapped hydro sources that can be more or less economically used to generate electricity that works competitive against gas. So we can do it, but it's going to take a lot of political will to make it happen. And I don't know if we have the will in British Columbia to make it happen. What I'm hoping will result is a kind of a hybrid where there's going to be some gas generation. It's just almost inevitable, I think, unless there's a war on this, but I just don't see that happening. And the government insists that some of the generation is required from electricity, because electricity in BC is clean electricity. 100% of our power today is clean energy, and that's one thing that's really unique about BC. And it could be that way with all those LNG plants if the government mandated it.
The one thing I could chuck in on top of that is the fact that also going through the environmental assessment process right now is the multi-billion-dollar Site C dam, which is proposed to produce, I believe it's 1,100 megawatts, which is would power 450,000 homes per year in British Columbia, and there's a source of potentially clean energy.
So I think LNG is a challenging situation for British Columbia. I mean, I don't look at it as would it wipe out the benefits from the carbon tax. I look at it as a whole nother source of potential carbon emissions that would be enormous for British Columbia. And I think one thing that we haven't done is really had a conversation to understand the impacts of LNG. So the scale that's being proposed by the government would almost have the same carbon emissions as the oil sands in Alberta. And I don't think anybody has a clue that that's the scale of pollution that we're talking about this new industry dumping into BC's air and into the global environment's air. So that's one thing, is we really need to understand that. Personally, I frankly don't believe that the scale that they're proposing is going to get developed. I think it's like a gold rush out there, and everybody's got their proposals in. Jeremy outlined, the 10 or so top ones. I think there's up to 18 now that are trying to develop. So I work with Clean Energy Canada, and we did that report that Jeremy was referencing. The author is Jeremy out there in the audience, and he'll have the numbers that I might not have accurately in my head. I just got off a plane from Nicaragua a couple hours ago. So yeah, we right now are on track to produce LNG that's 3 times dirtier than the cleanest LNG in the world, so-called cleanest. There's things that we could do. We outline in our report what we could do. Electrifying it is a huge piece of it. Electrifying the compression, also electrifying the upstream where we take the gas out. That actually requires an enormous amount of electricity as well, or power, which right now is gas-fired power. So there are ways that we could reduce the carbon footprint of it. There is not leadership from the government really forcing the companies to do this. One thing I would say is we put out that report in October. We put out a subsequent report that looked at the jobs that would be generated if we did power the compression stations with clean energy. And the companies have shifted from saying, no, never, not going to happen, to saying, oh yeah, we'll power 20% of this with renewable energy now. So 20%, it's only 20%, it's not a win, but I can tell you that they were saying never, no, we are not going to do it. So I would say we're one organization. There's a few others that have voices. I would say people need to stand up and start talking to the government and saying, either say what you think about it and say if you're going to produce this, we should do what the government committed, which is have the cleanest LNG in the world. So there's a bunch of technologies that are outlined in the report. You can get it at cleanenergycanada.ca.org. And so I think there's huge issues for carbon. I don't think it undermines the carbon tax, although you could, if you wanted to, equate the two. But I think it's a question for BC is, what kind of economy do we want to have? Another point I would make, my last point, is if we're going to go ahead with this carbon-intensive industry, then what are we going to do in other sections of the economy to reduce carbon emissions there? One thing that we really haven't tackled in BC is transportation. So let's take on transportation. We can't just increase emissions without actually dealing with emissions somewhere else, because we did make a commitment to reduce our carbon emissions by 2020. We need to meet that legislated commitment. So let's take on something different. And transportation, I think, is just waiting for government support.
Well, on that note, now that you've set that up for me, the law in BC is that we reduce our climate change emissions by 33% by 2020. We've so far made the commitments that the legally required commitments, targets so far. Now, there's no penalty, at least in terms of the way the legislation's structured, if you don't make your reduction targets, if you break the law, so to speak. But I think that we as legislators voted to say this is what we're going to do. This is something all parties have said they're committed to within BC, at least all currently elected parties. The only problem is that we had a plan to get to the first emission reduction requirements up to 2012 or so. We've not seen any strategy to get us to the next round of reductions. And so to get to 33% reductions in 2020, the government at the time when they did the law, they said, well, we figured out how to get to the, maybe the first 15, maybe the 20%. We're going to need to figure out something more to get to the next 70, 80% of the emission reductions. And that was before LNG was even in the conversation. So they have not, at least to my knowledge, come up with a plan to do both, or to really do emission reductions on either. When I, as critic or advocate for the environment, shadow minister for the environment, however you want to put it, took the Clean Energy Canada report and said, look, there's a lot of really good ideas here. Can we as government leaders say to the industry, this is what clean energy, this is what cleanest LNG in the world looks like? The government said it was foolhardy. So there's an issue now amongst some who believe, maybe you trade off the so-called economic benefits versus the environmental costs. And I think anybody who's looked at these things go, well, there's no such thing as a trade-off, really, in this sense. A short-term job versus long-term climate pain is not a good trade-off. So we need to reduce emissions wherever possible. Transportation, our homes, and there's so many different areas of the economy we could be reducing our emissions, becoming more efficient, regardless of if you care about climate change or not. It's just a better thing to do for the economy, for efficiency, for how you spend money. So I think that's where we need to go next, is go, okay, LNG might happen. Quite possibly we'll get a number of terminals, which would be good for in terms of dollars for the government, in terms of dollars for people and their jobs and their homes. But if it doesn't happen, we still have to reduce emissions. If it does happen, we still have to reduce emissions. So let's come up with a plan to go beyond climate change, carbon tax 5 years later, to say carbon tax 10 years later, 15 years later. What have we done since then?
Okay, thank you. So at this point, we have 20 minutes left, and I'm going to invite questions from the audience. Before I do, just a couple of remarks upon how this is going to go. A few rules of the road for audience questions. So I want you to briefly, if you're going to ask a question, introduce yourself. I'm going to repeat your question in shortened form so that everybody on the live stream actually hears it, because they won't necessarily hear it as well. But most important, to make everybody happy and to make my task easier, there's one rule that you have to follow, which is phrase your question in the form of a question. Okay? Okay. So if we're clear on that, and I'm going to ask the panel to make their comments. They're all invited to comment, but I'm asking them to keep them to 1 minute. So that we can actually get a number of questions in. So let's see who wants to ask a question. We've got one right here.
My name is Terry Zidane. I'm a policyologist in a different jurisdiction, and I advise ministers. So my background is transportation. stuff happening in the science. Is there any climatologists in the room? Are there any environmentalists in the room?
Are those questions?
Those are questions. Yes, okay, because I defer to them, because I'm not either a climatologist, whatever. Okay, we're at a tipping point. Every degree of warming in the near future is going to increase the use or the emission of non-energy greenhouse gases in the form of methane from lakes and frozen tundra and all that kind of stuff. The UN is going to, IPCC is going to release a report either tomorrow or Monday, and it's going to be not a very happy story. I agree with climate tax, but it is only one measure. What are the complementary measures that need to be put in place to keep the LNG in the ground, to keep the coal in the ground, to keep the tar sands in the ground, so that the emission profile of not only Canada, but the world is stabilized because of the tipping point?
Okay. Some quicker comments so that we can get more questions, but everybody can take a bite at this one.
Here's just one idea. We should reform our building codes so that we have, if you could do net positive buildings that actually add more energy rather than take more energy, or at the very least don't really need gas to keep them warm or air conditioning to keep them cool. And there's a ton of really good passive houses, one model that does that. And if we changed our building code, that could knock down emissions in a major way. And if we actually upgraded so many of the buildings that leak out heat like you wouldn't believe, we wouldn't be burning as much fuel in most commercial, residential, public buildings. I'd say that's just one way that we could get there.
Okay, so I'll give one too, and that's focus on electricity in addition to buildings. So electricity, have renewable portfolio standards, which is like a goal, a target of what you're going to have your grid be for renewable energy. And the FIT program, the feed-in tariff program, those are two very effective programs to drive your electricity system away from coal and away from gas and to renewables. There's lots of things to be learned from what Germany and Ontario did. They actually have some very good successes there, even though there's some challenges. But just like BC's carbon tax, take what they did, learn from it, and evolve a FIT program or renewable portfolio standard to drive your grid to renewables.
Okay, my comment on that is that I'm optimistic that we're gonna hit our targets. I'm very optimistic that in 20 years the world is going to be a very different place in terms of energy generation and carbon emissions. It's going to happen because clean energy is going to become more and more and more common all over the world, and it's going to be driven. The more we have governments pushing it through incentives and stimulus, the faster it's going to happen. But quite frankly, the bus has left the station, and we are getting to a world where there will be more and more clean energy. It will be a bigger and bigger chunk of global electricity consumption and production, and so that's one. It will happen. Number two, pricing for carbon. I'm not as confident as that, but I'm hopeful that we will proceed to price in carbon emissions from coal plants, from oil and gas production, from steel mills, cement, throughout transportation. So the BC carbon tax will be copied in many other places, or there'll be a cap and trade system that works like they have in Europe. That's going to help a lot. Putting a real cost to producing a ton of CO2 is going to make things like the tar sands, I would say, between that and charging the real cost of reclamation, uneconomic. And then thirdly, and this is something everybody can do in the whole world, and a lot of people are doing, it's use less electricity, use less fuel to drive, and stimulate, in terms of government, stimulate new technology. There's a huge amount of new technology coming in car technology, be it electric or hybrid or just simply better diesel automobiles, diesel trucks, natural gas driven trucks. Huge amount. The price of lithium batteries is plummeting. The world production is exploding. This is a way of storing electricity that you generate from things like windmills and solar plants. And all of this is helping to create what I really see as a revolution in energy consumption and energy demand. This is happening today. It's happening in China, it's happening in Europe, it's happening in North America. It just can't happen quickly enough. But I'm very confident that it will lead to a world where we won't need, certainly the tar sands, and we won't need a lot of the BC LNG business in the medium term. That is to say, more than 20 years.
I'd go with increased tax incentives for the development of renewable fuel sources, and also the government encouragement of organizations. And you have to excuse me, I work in initialisms all the time, so I can never remember the name of organizations. There's an outfit in Alberta called the CCEMC, which offers competitions to develop renewable programs, etc., develop new technologies. You might not like this, but there's also an organization we were hearing about at Globe this afternoon called COSIA, which I've been writing about for a number of years. They have developed hundreds of programs at a cost of about $1 billion to develop technologies for the oil sands, so they say. If organizations such as those can be helped out, all the better.
Okay, let's take another question. Yeah, you can pick one. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Dave Swan, and I'm the founder and CEO of Eco Options Energy Cooperative. We do fuel swapping, taking light trucks, pickups, cargo vans, and others, and swap them from gasoline or diesel to propane and shortly compressed natural gas. I think there's an excellent set of stuff that you said, Marin, about education. Because over the last 3 years, we've done a terrific job with our small membership of educating about what the costs of their vehicles are per kilometer. And the one significant failure I feel that our provincial government has really fallen down on badly is that there's been very little practical information that has told people what the actual benefits of carbon taxes or carbon offsets are to their lives. I believe that there's a huge amount of cynicism because I work with contractors all day long.
Sir,
sorry?
Question
is this. There's much that could be done, in my view, to promote the benefits of what we've accomplished. I don't see anything that really has tied it to what an individual benefit could be. What suggestions might you have about how we could tie these things back to the individual?
Well, I would argue that we have the Climate Change Secretariat within BC, and the idea was we were going to embed in every ministry and every government organization the need to fight climate change, and it was going to be from the schools all the way on up. That has withered on the vine. I think what we need to do is, if we as a species want to be serious about climate change, we need to treat it like the threat it is. We all downed tools, well, we didn't, but of course our grandparents and others did around World War II, for example, is one example where we decided this was the mission. We had to win this war. Of course, there are really no winners in a war, but in the sense of the battle, that was the mission. It went through all of society. Everybody felt part of the same mission. I think we need to treat climate change as the same kind of issue and work on it every day through all of our actions. It's not an add-on you do if you feel good about it. It's something that we just have to do. And that takes a government leader who believes that, but it also takes a society demanding that kind of action. Because the government will do all sorts of things if the public demands it and if it threatens their re-election. Take it from me.
Yeah, so I think that there is an opportunity that the government has. I fully agree. There has been no education and it hasn't become part of our daily lives. As Spencer mentioned, to meet our 2020 targets, we need a new climate action plan. Climate Action Plan 2. That was always the plan. Let's create a Climate Action Plan 2 that has citizen engagement in it, that has a process of dialogue with the residents of BC at the same time as we are developing, so that there's buy-in and support from people and that they feel like they were part of it and therefore they're part of implementing it. And through that, I think you could kickstart the education as well. Transparency, transparency, transparency. I think that's one of the things that we've heard from doing focus group work in in rural communities is people just don't know what is happening. They don't know what's happening to the carbon tax. They just don't get it. And I think that's been a thing that the government hasn't done. So I don't know if it's, you know, websites. There's all kinds of education tools. We all know what they are, but I do think it does take leadership. Gordon Campbell definitely demonstrated leadership in a way that was impressive. It was incredible for the time. I think in 2009, the Liberal government believed that they were elected in part because of the carbon tax and their position on the carbon tax. And I think what happened in 2013, well, what I've been told by politicians, is nobody talked to them about climate change. They didn't hear it at all. I mean, the government drove a jobs agenda, but the public, I think, feels like we are doing something, and so it just wasn't the issue of the day. And so it is up to us to get this back on the agenda again and to rally to have something done. And we have a good legacy to pull from, which could help drive the government forward again. We did it once, let's keep doing it.
Okay, my 2 bits worth on this subject is as follows. Real change happens from the bottom up and the top down. It either requires an awful lot of people who have a groundswell of opinion that the leaders get, or it takes some kind of consciousness on the top of the 2% of the leaders in business and government and other elements of civil society who are appointed to make change that they see in their wisdom will benefit their world. So, you know, so either works, and the best is always when you have both. I think this kind of thing tonight, the reason I came here is because I wanted to be part of that dialogue, and I think everybody here should applaud themselves for coming to be part of the dialogue. That's where the bottom-up change happens, and I personally see that groundswell now. I've seen it for 10 years now. It's come and gone with the vicissitudes of the economy. It took a hit in 2008, 2009, but it's coming back now. I've been to China many times, and I see, you know, the Chinese get it now. They see it. They see the pollution, the contamination of their environment as a not just a human health danger, but it's a political danger. And so the leaders are now making real change to try to tackle that. So it takes both sides, and I think just every single one of us can do an awful lot, and should do, and I know you people here tonight are doing. So good for you.
I agree with the bottom up and top down. I think it's probably fair to say that most of us probably have a blue box in our home, and we're putting it out to the curb once a week. What I would like to see is a little bit of leadership from Ottawa. We've seen them walk away from Kyoto. They promised a suite of emission standards. I think, what is it, one has come through and the rest haven't shown up. Well, they were promised 3-4 years ago.
And then again and again and again.
And then again and again and again. It's making us look rather foolish around the world, quite frankly.
Okay, we got time for one more question. So let's see the hands. I guess we'll go right here, sir. This will be our last question, and then I will say goodbye. Yeah.
My name's John Petrie. 2 questions.
That way they're filming your back.
Sorry?
Move that way, they're filming your back.
Sorry, okay. John Petrie. Why is carbon taxed and not electricity? Electricity exported from BC replaces carbon-generated electricity in the Western grid. BC Hydro, in its Site C documents, say exports of electricity from Site C would equivalent to 443 grams of CO2e savings per kilowatt hour. There is a substitution between electricity and carbon-generated electricity outside. So we should be, in my belief, we should be charging a consumption tax on electricity as well as carbon within BC. And the second question is, how come nobody knows this? How come this 443 gram per kilowatt hour document never got circulated in the media, and BC Hydro talks about 25 grams per kilowatt hour of the cost of production, which is more or less true. You can argue about it. But opportunity cost is a very significant way of looking at things.
Anyone want to take a swing at that one? I know I definitely didn't know that. Still may not know that. So, any takers?
All I'd say is that I can't get into the grams and the kilowatt hours. No, I'm not that expert on that. I'll leave that to Mr. Beatty over here. But I would say, though, that you're right in the sense that we need to think about not just BC and our little borders here, because I think there's the Pacific Institute of Climate Sciences over UVic right now. They're doing a study looking at what if you had a grid that connected Alberta and BC, trying to ask the question, can we get them off of coal? Can we get them off of more polluting energy production? And I think that's really worth asking. And I think the question of the states as well, that's an area that you could look at. But I'll throw it over here because that's about as much as I got on that.
Yeah, I don't have the grams either, but in terms of exporting electricity, just to note, Manitoba has just signed 2 contracts with the U.S., and our friends from the south here will know exactly where it is. I think it's Minnesota and Wisconsin below Manitoba, but Manitoba's hydro is able, one, they have enough power, and secondly, to help renewable power in states that don't have firm power. And hydro is firm power that can help backstop wind power and other renewables. So those kinds of north-south connections are being made already, and we could definitely increase our capacity to export clean energy to the south as well.
Okay, any other takers? Okay, well, listen, folks. On that note, I have learned a great deal tonight, and so now my little scheme of bringing the carbon tax south. Maybe I know a couple tricks, and I really appreciate all of you being here and giving us all of this wisdom. So let me just say in conclusion, again, I want to thank our sponsors. We are very grateful to Bloomberg BNA for sponsoring this event. We are grateful to Value Liquor for their wine donation, Bullfrog Power for the clean energy that powered our event. And thank you all for being here.